Welcome, everybody. Is this on? Testing? Oh, there we go. Welcome, everyone. You heard George's announcement, power strips are on order. In theory, they will arrive before the end of the workshop. We will see. So welcome, everyone, to the first Kubernetes new contributor workshop. This is, in fact, the first time that we're doing this. So you are the first class. Congratulations. This also means that you're guinea pigs, as in Gwen and I were just still working on this last night in terms of setting everything up.
That is totally a lie. I was super prepared.
Yeah. So there will be some rough patches, but we have a whole bunch of stuff for you. And as always with any of these things, you're not going to learn everything because there's a lot to learn. So I just want to say, first of all, welcome. So, presumably you're in here, you're taking your first or more likely second steps towards being a Kubernetes contributor. How many people filed an issue against Kubernetes or one of the close accessories? Great. How many people have filed a PR? Cool, okay. So we've got a few PR people. And the people who've already filed the PR before kind of spread around, which is awesome. So welcome on board. It's Kubernetes. It's an open project. Becoming a contributor starts with contributing. And we will be helping you make that contribution as effective as possible. Now, like I said, this is the first time we're doing a new contributor workshop. Part of that is that the Kubernetes project is actually pretty young, right? It's only 3 years old. When I joined Kubernetes, becoming a contributor was more like showing up in a small yacht, and the minute you get on board, somebody says, hold this rope. Now, it's a little bit more like joining one of these. And we're going to give you a half-day orientation tour. Because it's necessary, because there is so much stuff. Now, this is an orientation tour, so you're not going to learn all the things. This is going to be a lot of information. We don't expect you to retain it all. The idea is for you to learn enough things that you know where to go to ask further questions, which is the most confusing and the hardest part of, which Slack channel do I ask this in, or which mailing list do I ask this on, or what's the word for that? And that is what we're trying to get through. I mean, there's going to be hands-on exercises, there's going to be group exercises to get you used to contributing. But really, this is mainly about orientation. So hopefully this describes everybody in the room. We just asked, right, is some of you, how many people would describe themselves as basically advanced users of Kubernetes? How many people are beginning users of Kubernetes? Okay, that's some beginning users. How many people here are working in a job where Kubernetes is officially part of your job, like it's part of your job description? Yeah, that's it. Most people. How many people here already have something about Kubernetes that's broken and you want to know how to fix it? Yeah. That's how it gets started. That's how I started in the 90s with a different open source project, where I said, this is wrong, this is not to spec. And they're like, great, well, the broken code is here, see if you can fix it. And then 18 years of contributions later before I switched to Kubernetes. So that's how it starts. So we are going to have a full lineup of people. This has actually changed around a little bit at the last minute because we had a couple of people with travel problems. So Sen Lu from the SIG testing is going to actually be spotting for Aaron, and we'll see who is doing local build and test later on because we've swapped that role twice. But a bunch of people from different parts of the project will be coming to talk to you about contributing to their parts of the project, which is part of the idea here because it's a big project and it has a lot of pieces. You want to hear from different people. So this is our lineup here, approximately. Like I said, this is the first time we've done this. So we may go a little off schedule on this. For example, The tour of repositories might be before or after the break, depending on how things work out. We're going to actually give you like a full 20-ish minute break because we think you'll need it. There'll be a lot of stuff here. And we're going to be going through a lot of stuff. So, but the whole goal here is to move you up this stack. Because one of the various parts of the project I participate in is called SIG Contributor Experience, which is who's running all of the contributor stuff. And one of the things we discussed in SIG Contributor Experience is what's going on with the future of the project. And what we need more than anything right now in Kubernetes is actually senior reviewers. And the only way that's going to work is if we get some number of you to the status of senior reviewer. So that is our goal. Now, it's not going to happen next week, but it could happen by next year, and we would love to see that. And so this starts with moving from the first couple of steps of non-member contributor to, from non-contributor to non-member contributor to member. And we can get there very quickly. So, our first part, I'll turn it over to Guinevere. Guinevere.
You keep doing that, Josh.
Joe. I did live with Genevieve for 5 years, so I just
We don't want to hear about that.
Yeah. So, okay, who's going to take you through CLA signing? So thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Josh. Hi, everyone. Are you all awake and non-jet lagged, or is that just me? All right. So, who here has already signed the CLA? Awesome. Who here has not signed the CLA? Cool. This is great. We're going to be ahead of schedule. Did anyone run into trouble with anything? Is anyone's CLA still pending? Nothing like that? Excellent. Very cool. So let me just forward through these slides because this is something we don't really need for you. That's excellent. Very cool. So our next section is going to be, where do I even get started? And this is going to be a little bit of a big picture, kind of. Oh, are we having some people joining us in the back? Oh, never mind. All right, cool. So who here remembers the Choose Your Own Adventure games from the 80s and all that and later? And I don't know, I'm a huge D&D nerd. So this is where I give you a little bit of an overview of where you can get started, just kind of a big picture, top-level idea of how many areas in the Kubernetes project there even are. I mean, there is place for almost anyone to contribute. There are so many different contributor origin stories out there. Some people come basically from the Linux Foundation or just a community background and just want to build the community. They want to improve how everyone is interacting. I mean, there are people in the project whose entire job title is community member. Community manager, sorry. Maybe I am a little jet lagged. And that's actually really, really important with a big, new, fast-paced project like this one. Then there are people who just started using this technology and, like Josh already said, you need a feature, you need a bug fix, you just really want to learn about it, stuff like that. All those are totally valid ways to contribute to the community. I don't even know how to use this thing. Let's find out. All right, so one of the first really concrete examples is you can contribute to the docs. Especially if you are new to the technology in general, this is a really great way to learn about it. The other thing, what we get out of it, why do we want a bunch of newcomers contributing to the docs? Well, because if it is not clear to you, that means it's also not clear to the next newcomer. And newcomers have a unique perspective in terms of, hey, wait, I don't get it. What does this mean? So please, contribute to the documentation, contribute to the way things are explained, write your tutorials while you have that fresh perspective. We love that. I noticed, I wrote I made some comments about this thing called a SIG. That is a concept we will learn more about throughout the day. Brief overview, it's called a special interest group. The project's humans are organized in these special interest groups, and they work on areas of the project. These two particular SIGs are the ones that work a lot on documentation, processes, website, that sort of thing. Then we have a really huge and complicated test setup, and we have an entire SIG dedicated just to testing. In fact, there are people whose entire jobs involve just making sure that the Kubernetes tests run. They're a friendly bunch. If that's your jam, go ahead and check out a little bit more what they do. Most of their code is written in Go. So, speaking of code, you can go ahead and contribute to the core repository. Yes, anyone is welcome to submit pull requests, to open issues, and to learn about what makes all of this work beneath the covers. I can't really tell you which SIGs to join for this until you've sort of gotten your head into things a little bit deeper, because unfortunately Kubernetes is a huge mono repo, so the command line, the CLI, the other related projects, a lot of them are actually under one core repository. And then there's also related projects which use Kubernetes or manage Kubernetes. For example, Helm is a big project that has its own charts repository they're called Helm charts. So that's another area where you can contribute. That's maybe not the core repository, but is absolutely, definitely part of the whole community. So this sort of rolls into, where do I find my absolute very first topic? So who here, maybe someone of you has already used Kubernetes and found a bug or found something that they would want fixed. Or maybe, I remember when I first started, something about shutting down Kubernetes nodes didn't really work the way it was supposed to. And at the time, I was still learning, but that was actually kind of a good opportunity to fix it. So sometimes you find your first topic very naturally as part of what you're working on. And sometimes you're just so overwhelmed that it's just like, where do I start? How can I even get going with anything like this? It's super, it can be really overwhelming. So what I did, for example, was I tried to learn about how to contribute, and that was already really hard. So I decided to document the contributing process a little bit more in depth and a little bit more easy to follow, and hopefully I succeeded. We'll go over that hands-on later in the day. So this is sort of where I think I'm going to hand it over to Josh so that he can kind of lead you through a little sharing exercise with your tables. There we go.
Howdy, everybody. Howdy. So, this is the contributor workshop. Like I said, it is participatory. And so we are going to have our first exercise, which does not involve your laptop, which is good because the power strips are not here yet. This first exercise is just a group exercise, which is based on what you already know about Kubernetes. You're going to go around in your tables and introduce yourself, and then suggest where you think you might be interested in contributing to Kubernetes, based on what you already know. And how that relates to either your background or interests. So we're not getting into SIGs or specific code modules or specific projects right now, but this would be more of a, hey, I have 10 years of experience doing network security, and therefore I think I'm really going to be interested in Kubernetes security and maybe overlay networking. Or you might say, hey, I'm actually an application developer, and so I'm probably really going to be a lot more interested in the applications end of things. Or somebody's going to say, hey, I really, really care about having clear documentation, and that's where I see myself going. So we're going to take about 10, 12 minutes for you to just go around your tables and talk to each other one at a time. Like I said, introduce yourself, explain to the other folks at your table how you think you might be interested in contributing to Kubernetes, and then go on to the next person. So let's go ahead and get started. Hey folks, so how many tables are still going? How many tables are still going where people have not spoken yet? Is everyone finished with the exercise? Awesome. Yay. Okay, so we're going to finish up here. So out of this sort of discussing here is, so how many people think they're going to start with documentation of the website? Okay, got a few people. Okay. How many people plan to dive right into core Kubernetes code? Wow. How many testing geeks do we have here? Anybody into testing? Yeah, okay. Oh, and actually, here's an area where we really need help. How many performance geeks do we have? How many people here into performance? Because we super need people on performance testing and scalability, but cool. How many people are really interested in one of the close accessory projects like Helm or Guinevere or something like that? Oh yeah, lots of people. Okay, and how many people here are more focused on applications on top of Kubernetes? Cool, okay. So lots of stuff. So the next thing up is I'm going to turn it back over to my co-presenter who's going to talk to you about communication. Welcome back.
Thanks again. As I was listening to everyone introduce themselves at the tables, I realized that I completely failed at this communication thing, where I didn't introduce myself. Hi, everyone. My name is Guinevere. I'm here from the United States, from Seattle. I work at Samsung, and I get to do some community and some upstream contribution work as part of my job. Moving right along, now that you know who's actually talking to you, let's talk about communication. I really like this image. I really like capybaras. They are the world's largest rodent. And they have this weird reputation of getting along with everybody, including their own predators, which I just kind of don't want to know what happened in the bottom right picture there. I'm a little worried about that one. But I just kind of feel like the entire Kubernetes project is a little bit like one giant fuzzy capybara, because there are so many different people in it, and there is a place for everybody. And I don't just believe that, I have experienced that personally. And I believe the reason is that this project makes a huge effort at creating community rather than just technology. And I think that the technology is better for it, because we get more voices and more diverse voices and more different people coming at it from all their different backgrounds. I mean, Josh just asked you, hey, what are all these different people in this room interested in doing? And there were so many different answers, and that is a good thing. So when it says, you know, with a lot of these things, it's like, hey, sign our code of conduct. Hey, you need to do this first thing. Everybody's just kind of like, eh. So in my opinion, it is the way in which we enforce or encourage this code of conduct. We follow the CNCF code of conduct. It is not very long. I encourage everyone to actually read it and reflect on it. But as with all of these things, it kind of boils down to, you know, be nice and be respectful and try to do your very best at assuming the very best of other people. I think that is the basic core concept of any of these codes of conduct. So you can read this on your own time. But from my perspective, that is what it boils down to. So that said, it's always helpful to know a couple of the little unspoken rules that exist in any community. And especially as newcomers, it's very easy to run into these. This is basically a list of 3 pet peeves that I have encountered, that I have committed against the community. Well, I might not have committed all of them, but some of them. So, technical questions. If you have questions about Kubernetes, I'm not sure why I said if. When you have questions about Kubernetes, the place to ask them is not GitHub. I know that some projects do this differently, and I also know that there are many answers to be found when searching the GitHub project. But please do not open an issue because you have a question on how to spin up a cluster. That's what Stack Overflow is for, and we have a really, really lively Slack community. Who here has not joined Kubernetes Slack? Well done. Oh, all right, we have some people. Excellent. It's okay. We're going to go over that. This is great. And the next 2 are really just kind of related. Because this is a distributed project, a lot of the discussion is going to happen on GitHub. So if there's an issue, you passionately care about this feature, you really want this feature, expect some pushback on your issue. Expect that people will say, well, we would love to do that, but because of these reasons, we can't. And it's okay to engage in a discussion as long as you stay courteous. It is also important that you follow up on your issue. There's nothing more frustrating than somebody fixing a bug and then needing to rebase or update a version, and it just sits there. Oh, I feel so awful every time. I'm like, but I really want that bug fix. Just please follow up. And then the last point is really kind of the same thing. Stay patient. There's people working on Kubernetes all over the world. You can't expect that your reviewer is possibly awake 24 hours of the day. They may live halfway around the world and be asleep currently. So please keep all those things in mind. And if you keep these 3 basic ideas in the back of your head, you'll probably be okay. Don't do what I did. I tried to open my very first pull request against the Kubernetes community repo, and I found it very, very difficult to figure out how to do that. So I opened an issue, and it said, what did it say? It said, documentation confusing and outdated. That was the title. I feel kind of bad about that, but people were really patient and kind and said, hey, we know that our contributor guide kind of sucks. You want to help us fix it? Because that's sort of the open source idea. Hey, yeah, we know it's broken. Do you want to fix it? You take responsibility for the project, even as a newcomer. So when any of these things when you're ever confused about something, go ahead and ask questions. And there are many, many places to ask questions. Who here has ever run into this issue where they had a question and didn't really know where to ask? Awesome. All right, so this is where I'm going to take you on a little Slack tour. So if you want to go ahead and if you have not joined Slack, I encourage you to sign up by going to the little turquoise link. It's a short one. You can copy it. I'm going to show you my Slack, my Kubernetes Slack right here. So there are so many channels. Again, it is super overwhelming. I'm just browsing through these channels. There's not a whole lot of use in browsing channels. What I really encourage everyone to join is Kubernetes users. That's where a lot of questions can be asked and will be getting answered. So you'll see here just browsing that channel that people are getting help. Then there is also I don't know if I have joined that one, Kubernetes Novice. That is for you if you are learning. I don't know why I didn't join that one. And I personally, as a member of SIG Contributor Experience, encourage you all to join the SIG Contribex channel because it is literally this SIG's job to help you out if you are confused. Even if your question has nothing to do with contributing, you can still go ahead and ask, Bob, you can still go ahead and ask, hey, where would I go find help for this thing? And someone will point you in the right direction. Again, if you're patient and if you just kind of keep at it and follow through, you will probably get your answer. Hooray, we have 2 new members on SIG Contribex channel. Excellent. So those are some basic channels, but you can look around and see each SIG also has their own channel. So once you find your area of interest and your group of people that work on similar things and that are excited about your things, you can find out what SIG they are in and join their channel as well. There are many ways to communicate, and all of them, unfortunately, take some effort from you. I mean, I guess that's sort of how communication works. There are community meetings. There's the big Kubernetes community meeting once a week. For me, it's on Thursdays at 10, but that's totally different for you. I'll show you the calendar. You can join mailing lists. If you already are active on GitHub, if you have opened an issue or created a PR, created an issue, opened a PR, that way around, people are probably going to come and comment. It is totally okay to at their username on that discussion. That is 100% okay. Don't be surprised if they don't react because some reviewers and contributors get so much noise on their GitHub notifications that they just won't notice. Don't take it personally. There are meetups in many parts of the world, and again, for help to get started, we also offer Kubernetes office hours. Again, that is, I will show you where to find all that. So, let's see here. We have people joined on Slack, I hope. Right, so on the main Kubernetes website, Kubernetes IO community, I'm going to endeavor to put all of these links in a bundle at the bottom of the slide deck once it gets submitted to wherever it is. This is sort of the part where I was, in fact, a little bit behind. So this is the schedule of Kubernetes community meetings. It is completely cluttered, but if you go ahead and look at the Thursday right here, let me make this a little bigger, you will see that there is the Kubernetes community meeting at 10 a.m. Now, if you already know a lot about Kubernetes and you have an idea of what the different parts are, this community meeting is great to attend. When I first started learning about Kubernetes, I attended the first community meeting my very first week at work, and then I said, I don't even know what's going on. So I didn't attend for half a year, and then half a year later I attended again, and magically everything made sense. So this is where I'm going to ask you to be patient with yourself, because as Josh said in the very beginning, it's a big topic. So this is also where you can find all the meetings for all the different SIGs and working groups. And one of the best ways, once you know where you want to contribute, one of the best ways to do so is to find out which SIG is responsible for your area of interest and go to a meeting. A lot of the time, there's maybe only 10 people in that meeting, and they will see you and they will ask you to introduce yourself, and this is an excellent way to find mentors and people to help you out. Even if they don't work at your company, even if it's not even about Kubernetes. I had someone from SIG Contributor Experience spend 3 hours of his time to teach me some Git tricks. Just because that's the kind of community we have. I already mentioned there's Kubernetes meetups all over the world. If there is not one where you are, you can absolutely ask the Kubernetes community to help you with starting one. There is money and advertising help as well. So I have a question. Where do you think you would go if you wanted to start a meetup? Where would you ask for help? CNCF meetup? Good idea. Slack? Where on Slack? SIG Contribex, thank you. That's what I was looking for. Yes, but yeah, CNCF, absolutely. Somebody will point you in the right direction, and I happen to know the person who can set you up, so you can come talk to me as well. Who here does not have a meetup in their area? Okay, so there are some opportunities here for contribution. Not all contributions are code. All right, if you are on Twitter, you should follow Kubernetes IO on Twitter, just for, updates. This is the latest one, I think, maybe. I don't know that I necessarily want to refresh my Twitter feed. And then Google Groups. This one's a little tricky. Is there anyone who has tried to join the mailing lists? Yeah? Oh, a couple people. Cool. Any trouble? So let me just kind of walk you through here. I think the trick is really that you need to know which groups are good to join for. So there's the Kubernetes Dev at Google Groups. That's for developing on the core repository. But I really encourage joining the Kubernetes users because that's where a lot of questions get answered and asked. So let's see. You go to Google Groups or groups.google.com. And then let's see, Kubernetes users. And here we are, Kubernetes user discussion and Q&A. And you can go ahead and join that group. I didn't join that group, so that's cool. I'm going to do that right now in front of everybody, walking the talk. Awesome. I might have to tweak my notifications, actually. That's okay. I'll go ahead and do that later. So you'll see there's a lot of questions. Kubernetes ingress, that's actually something that was relevant for me for work last week. It's a pretty useful thing to have in your inbox and to be able to access. All right, I think, all right, cool. So I really encourage you all to just go ahead and join those Google Groups right now if you can. Just that way you have it, and maybe you won't remember everything from today's presentation. So this way you'll get an email being like, hey, how does ingress work? Oh, I think it works this way. So, all right. There are more ways to stay in touch with the community than these. But these are basically the biggest and best ones. And yes, they do involve you having to reach out and talking and meeting people. And this is overall a good thing. We are trying really hard to keep the community from becoming this thing where you need to know someone who knows someone. But at the same time, it really can't hurt to know people. So I encourage you all to go out there and do some of that yourselves. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Josh, who is going to tell you how to find those SIGs that I have been hinting at.
Hello? We hearing this? Yeah, there we go. Terrific. Okay. So, we've already referred to Kubernetes SIGs several times. SIGs. Stands for Special Interest Group. Kind of sounds like a meetup, doesn't it? I was kind of amused at this use of SIGs. The reason that we're actually using the Special Interest Group term comes from the IETF. Was copy after that. Anybody here involved with the IETF in some way? We got a serious network geek here. We got one person there. So In the IETF, for anybody who's not familiar with it, this is the organization that determines the international specifications for all of the networking and internet things. So HTML standard and email standard and IPv6 and everything else. And the way they divide up their group, their work, is departmentally into SIGs. And each SIG is kind of its own subproject with its own workload, its own individual leadership for that SIG. Now, in this case, in Kubernetes, we have some specific things that we talk about with SIGs. So, right, is that every SIG is going to have a charter, although for some SIGs their charter is still in progress, because we kind of introduced the charters last year. So each SIG is going to have their own charter. Each SIG in Kubernetes is going to be responsible for a set of code, although that's not necessarily Kubernetes code. It may be code for other things, like testing code, for example. But every SIG has a repository or directories or other bits of code that they are responsible for. Some SIGs have their own repos under the Kubernetes organization. Every SIG automatically gets a Slack channel set up and automatically gets a mailing list. And currently the mailing lists are all in Google Groups, although that may change within the next few months. Because, is anybody here from China? There's a problem with Google Groups in China. It's blocked. So, but right now all the mailing lists are in Google Groups, and so each one gets its own mailing list. SIGs are expected to have meetings, and as far as I know, they all do. The meetings tend to be either weekly or every other week. Most of the meetings are on a video conferencing system called Zoom, which we found is good for allowing anybody who has the link to join and supporting up to several dozen participants. But this does mean that a few of you may have platform issues to work out in terms of getting the Zoom thing installed. For what it's worth, for anybody who's running containerized desktop, we actually got Zoom to create a Flatpak for their video thing, so you can run it even on a containerized desktop. And then some of the SIGs that are larger and busy and responsible for more stuff also have their own subprojects under the SIG. Now, I was looking at the whole list of SIGs that we have. There are a lot of them. And I'm like, okay, one of the things that really helps to understand this is to come up with some categories for the different kinds of SIGs that we have. So these categories are mine. These are not official categories at all. But I think it'll help you to actually sort of navigate the whole group of SIGs that we have. Keeping in mind, by the way, the other important thing to do is that we are creating new SIGs, and then some SIGs are shutting down on a fairly regular basis. Not every week, but certainly like every Kubernetes release cycle, which is like every 3 months or so, you'll discover that the list of SIGs has changed. Because the technology is changing all the time, and because the technology is changing, what we need to spend our time on changes. So these different sort of areas of SIGs are, first, we have a lot of SIGs that are sort of devoted to feature areas, plumbing. Then we have our cloud providers and Meta and Docs. And we'll get into a little bit of this. So the largest, by far the largest number of SIGs are concerned with a specific portion of Kubernetes functionality. SIG UI is a good example of this. So the SIG UI people actually care about the dashboard and the API that the dashboard consumes. Or more common one, SIG scheduling, right? They're in charge of the core Kubernetes scheduler as well as the scheduling API and some other things related to scheduling. SIG storage, everything having to do with storage, SIG CLI, are in charge of kube control and the kube control API and that sort of thing. So these are fairly defined. There's basically sort of modules within Kubernetes that these groups are in charge of. Now, some of these are actually a little bit deceptive because because the areas they work in, some SIGs have broader or more interesting responsibilities than you would necessarily know. Because, for example, you would say from the name, SIG-auth is in charge of authentication and the authentication API and tokens and that sort of thing, which they are. But because of the history of the project, SIG-auth has actually become the SIG for everything involving security. Except that SIG network also has some security responsibilities for obvious reasons. So by the way, I've got this list of SIGs in the slides. I'm trying to remember. How do I flip? How do I flip between screens? Oh, okay. Got it. Community. Okay. No, it's not what I want. So if you go to the community repo, the better place to actually find all of this information, rather than from my slides, although with not with the categories, because like I said, I made the categories up, is that we have a what? How do I get out of this? Okay, there we go. Sorry, I use a Linux desktop. It's always the OS change. So if you actually look through this, we have a whole master list of SIGs. And this is kept reasonably up to date. It may trail reality by a couple of weeks. The SIGs are responsible for updating their own information. Sometimes if things change, particularly because a SIG lead drops out, that may not be reflected. It may take a couple of weeks to get updated, but there's a reasonably updated set of information. So this is the sort of master list of all of the different SIGs and what they do. So like I was talking about SIG-auth. Now, what we have here is we have the master list of what the SIG is, who are the leads, when their meeting time is, Slack and the mailing list and everything else. And if you actually click through on this, okay, why is, okay. So you actually can get more information. Every SIG maintains a page in here that has more information. And again, so we go through here for our SIG structure, right, is you have the meetings and that sort of thing. Now, the other way to get the meetings is to subscribe to the Kubernetes calendar, which is a Google calendar, which I recommend. I kind of sort of recommend that you do. I mean, I subscribe to it. The annoying thing is that, of course, it will put a million things on your calendar because there's about 30 hours a week of SIG and working group and et cetera meetings. So it does allow you to play a little bit of calendar Tetris. But you can just look at the calendar and actually look at that, but you can also get up the meetings here. Most SIGs actually keep agendas of meeting notes, so if the meeting is at a time that's ridiculous for your time zone, you can follow this. Most SIGs, if they're using Zoom, have channels set up for auto record, so you can actually watch the meetings, which you can again get links from here to actually see what happened in the SIG. And then the other thing is a lot of stuff, like for example, there's a lot of bits of the Kubernetes, like contributor documentation and stuff will say, hey, check this with a SIG lead, right? Or a SIG lead needs to approve this. And this is where you get this list of leads. Now, depending on the SIG's charter, every SIG needs to have leads, and depending on the SIG's charter, those leads may actually be divided into two different kinds, or they might not. Most of the SIGs, you just have a list of leads. A few SIGs divide out the chairs, who are in charge of making sure that the SIG has meetings and that they're taking care of their issues and everything else, and technical leads who are in charge of the actual code. So if you actually see chairs versus technical leads, that's what that division means. And then we have links to the Slack channel, the mailing list, an example search on the SIG PRs and everything like that, and I'll actually show you that. any GitHub teams associated with this, and if it's a SIG that has subprojects, the subprojects will also be listed here. There we go. Okay. So, again, if you're looking for a particular Kubernetes feature, a particular feature or aspect of Kubernetes that you care about, there's a large number of SIGs that are associated with particular areas of the Kubernetes code. Now, there's a second group of SIGs that I call kind of plumbing SIGs, and these are SIGs that are in charge of aspects of the Kubernetes code that kind of cut across all of these other SIGs. I mean, not that everything isn't interactive, but particularly these SIGs, SIG cluster lifecycle. Now, what most people know SIG cluster lifecycle from is kubadmin, right? Which they're in charge of as a subproject. But also, they are in charge of everything having to do with upgrade and downgrade of Kubernetes. So they file upgrade and downgrade bugs against all of the other SIGs. So there's a sort of meta issue. SIG API machinery is in charge of the implementation of the Kubernetes API, and since the Kubernetes API really defines what Kubernetes is, or the collection of APIs, their stuff sort of cuts across everything else, and SIG instrumentation is in charge of visibility for everything. So this is sort of our plumbing metagroups. And then we have a whole set of SIGs devoted to particular cloud providers. So anybody, by the way, work directly on or with a particular cloud provider? Yeah, so we got a few people. So like for you, if you're going in this, you're probably going to get involved with a cloud provider SIG, right? So for every public cloud that has sort of official Kubernetes support, there is one of these cloud provider SIGs that is in charge of that. And all of these are fairly busy right now because we're in the process of taking the cloud provider code out of the core Kubernetes code and getting it to use the new cloud provider API. So if you join one of these SIGs, expect to get handed something almost immediately, because they're busy. And then we have a whole set of SIGs that are devoted to aspects of running the project, the Kubernetes project. So SIG contributor experience you've already heard a lot about. SIG architecture is in charge of anything that defines the sort of architecture of Kubernetes and components and how they interact with each other. So again, if you need to ask somebody about changing how the scheduler communicates with a controller, for example, that would be a SIG architecture matter before it went to any kind of a technical implementation. SIG product management is in charge of looking at things that for long-term Kubernetes development. They're in charge of the whole KEP process you hear about later on. SIG release, which is actually my primary SIG. So by the way, I just realized I didn't introduce myself either. So I'm Josh Berkus. I work for Red Hat. My job is Kubernetes Community Manager at Red Hat. On the Kubernetes project, my main SIG, and so here we're getting to the whole SIG thing, which is, you notice, people who contribute to Kubernetes end up being identified with particular SIGs. And that just happens because, honestly, everything in Kubernetes is so busy that even if you are involved in multiple SIGs, you're going to probably end up spending most of your time on one SIG. At least seasonally, just because there's too much to do for you to be a major contributor on multiple SIGs unless you don't like sleeping. So SIG release is actually my main SIG. I'm lead for the 111 release team, which rotates around, and I'll talk more about that later. And then SIG testing obviously is in charge of all of the tests for Kubernetes, and so for running the project. So you've got these also as ways to get started. And one of the nice things about the meta SIGs is they can be good to get involved in if you are trying to get an idea of how the whole project runs. Because if you're involved with SIG testing or SIG release or contributor experience or project management, that involvement actually requires you to talk to all of the other SIGs. So, and then, what is actually probably numerically in terms of the number of contributors, the biggest single SIG, the folks who are in charge of documentation and our website, because our website is mostly documentation, is SIG docs. And even if you are laser focused on one other SIG, you will end up, if you do any feature implementation at all, you will end up being a contributor to SIG docs because you are required to supply documentation for that feature or to get someone else to do it for you. And you will hear from SIG docs if you do not supply that documentation. So it's a big one. Now, here's where we get into a little bit of chaos simply because things are changing. So where things are changing is, in addition to the SIGs, we have the second concept called working groups. And there's still a number of groups around that are called working groups. We are moving from working groups as a concept. So a working group was we're moving as a working group from a concept to subprojects as a concept. Because a lot of the relationship between working groups and SIGs and the mission of working groups wasn't really all that clear. Now, here for these things, what I'm talking about is for stuff that's really specific. So, for example, Helm. Helm is under SIG apps, which is in charge of application, API, etc. But it's something fairly specific under SIG app. I mean, actually, in this case, Helm is a separate project, so it's really charts. Weirdly, it's actually charts that are the subproject because we have this charts repo in Kubernetes. Sometimes these subprojects involve goals. So one of the working groups that we have is called SIG Resource, is called WG Resource Management. It's the Resource Management Working Group. And their goal is to add a bunch of instrumentation to Kubernetes to allow you to see things like hardware stats across a variety of platforms. And they've been doing a lot of really hard work in that regard. And that is their entire focus. And from that perspective, they're kind of under SIG node, which is in charge of everything that happens on the individual machine for the SIG. And then sometimes there are sub-focuses of an obvious SIG. Like, for example, we actually have a SIG big data, which is involved with pretty much everybody looking at streaming and data processing and databases and everything else on the Kubernetes platform. And then they have this machine learning, which is currently defined as a working group, which will probably be a sub-project in the future. Because it's the same thing. So this is our current list of working groups, but expect this to change. And unlike the SIGs, SIGs change about quarterly, the list of SIGs changes. The working group list, in terms of which working groups are active, changes rather more frequently. Because, for example, when you have working groups that are goal-oriented, that they're saying, hey, the entire goal of this working group is to implement these 6 features. Then when feature number 6 is done, the working group dissolves. And so these change around a lot more frequently. And I'm actually pretty sure that we're due to do an audit of these because I know a couple of these are no longer at all active. Plus, we're changing to the sub-project program. So, one of your hardest things getting started in Kubernetes is figuring out which SIG you want to start with. Because dividing up the whole universe of Kubernetes into 30-odd SIGs that we have, a lot of the divisions are not necessarily going to be obvious, and figuring out how that relates to actually work on may require a little bit of trial and error. So we talked about figuring out what it is you're interested in contributing to. So once you have the thing that you're interested in contributing to, the second step is to actually figure out which SIG does that. So I'd actually like to have a couple of people, because we did the exercise earlier, and I'd like to have a couple of people who are willing to actually raise their hand, particularly if you know what you're interested in working on, but you don't know anything about the SIGs. I'd like you to raise your hand, and I will try to pick a SIG for you. Storage. Okay, well that's SIG storage. That's an easy one. Thank you. It's a gimme, yeah?
Robotics and edge.
Robotics. So like Kubernetes controlling robotics? See, that's a good one. See, I don't even know who would do that. So that's one of those cases where you actually want to pop into a couple of general community forums. Because I don't actually think there is anyone currently doing that, and it's not a specific SIG responsibility. And that's the sort of thing that might, for example, end up being a sub-project under, say, SIG node, unless we eventually get a SIG IoT, which is not impossible.
Analytics has stuff going on.
Yeah, analytics has stuff going on, right? So there you're going to have SIG Big Data or the machine learning sub-project under SIG Big Data. One more? Yeah?
Observability and metrics.
Okay, observability metrics. So SIG instrumentation and a whole variety of sub-projects under them. And then that branches out to other projects, right? Heapster, Prometheus, things that are not, and so here's your second thing, which is there are a lot of things that are intimately tied in with Kubernetes that are not considered under Kubernetes. But you'll have plenty of conversations about, say, Prometheus in SIG instrumentation, even though Prometheus is a separate project, and for that matter, a separate thing under the CNCF.
So maybe you could add a little wisdom on this, like, so instrumentation and metrics.
Yeah.
There are how you manage the cluster, and then there's how you might manage an application running on the cluster. And
Yeah.
Are those in two different SIGs, or?
It's a very good question, right? And that's one of the questions that you need to ask. You get in there, which is possible that. Yeah, so okay, I'm going to repeat the question for the video, which is, Bob was pointing out that some of these things can get divided up because there's SIG instrumentation, which has all of the instrumentation and ties into all of the metrics and other information for the Kubernetes cluster itself. But sometimes statistics and instrumentation for applications running on top of the cluster might be handled differently. And so if that's what you're primarily interested in, like you say, hey, I'm going to be running Cassandra on Kubernetes, I really care about monitoring my Cassandra nodes, et cetera, then that might actually fall under SIG apps instead. And so you can always start your joining a SIG with a question by saying, hey, go over to the SIG, the Slack is good for this, if you're willing to join Slack. And go over to the SIG and say, hey, I'm really interested in topic X. Is that in the SIG? Because like I said, we have this universe of things that Kubernetes does. And all of those things needed to be assigned to a SIG. So sometimes areas of responsibility for very specific things can be a little odd. Because they got inherited. Like for example, we've got this sub-practice and a couple of sub-projects in Kubernetes that have to do with having Kubernetes control virtualization. So Kubernetes control VMs. And for largely historical reasons, that's ended up under SIG node, which is in charge of the individual machines. And so you wouldn't know that off the bat. And so you have to ask questions. Now, in the event that what you're really focused on is a sub-project, like say you're really focused on machine learning, you want to also join the parent SIG of that sub-project and preferably attend their SIG meetings if you're going to be attending meetings at all. Because the idea is that these sub-projects sort of get rolled up, and often the sub-project stuff will get discussed in the main SIG meeting or in the main SIG channel. And that's why we have it as a concept of sort of sub-projects. So the other thing is, if you get stuck, for the people whose questions I didn't answer, and you're saying, which SIG covers this? Again, SIG contribx. It's what we do there, right? So Slack channel mailing list, if you want to ask that question of, hey, this is really the kind of code, documentation, testing, concept, implementation I care about, which SIG covers that, that is one of the best places to ask for that. And we will go and try to, if we don't know off the bat, we will try to figure that out for you. Like if you're really nervous about this whole joining Kubernetes thing, you're not really sure to talk to, you don't want to bother the SIG leads, and you've never done anything before, you can ask us to do that. And I have done that for other people and gone out and said, hey, I'm going to talk to the SIG lead, and hey, do you actually cover, robotics? If somebody was doing robotics, do you know anyone else is doing that? I can't actually do that. I mean, if you're not shy, go ahead and do that yourself. People do actually respond to questions, not necessarily in a timely fashion because everybody is super busy, but they're fine with questions from newcomers, particularly on, particularly if you're asking, is this you or not? So now there's a second part of the project, and here we get into significantly more chaos. If you look at the set of repositories for Kubernetes, its organization is more historical than planned. We're kind of cleaning it up, and I'm going to give you the state of things right now, with the understanding that things are going to be moving around because we realize it's a mess. But if you're actually looking at something and you're saying, hey, it makes no sense whatsoever that this particular repo is under here, you're probably right. It does probably actually make no sense. It was probably there because somebody put it there a year and a half ago because they didn't have another place to put it, and then it got stuck there. And we'll be moving it eventually. So big thing, core repository, Kubernetes, right? GitHub, Kubernetes. Everybody found that on their own, right? That's the easy one. This also gets referred to as K/K. A lot of times when people offhand, they say, oh, that's in K/K. That's what they're referring to because you type it out. But that's Kubernetes. And that is where the core code is. It is where most of the functional code for the project is. It's this gigantic repository with, I don't know what we're up to now, 2 million lines of code or something. There has been a whole ongoing conversation about maybe breaking up the main repository and trying to break it up into modular sub-repositories. There are a lot of obstacles to actually doing that, which is why I can't give you a timeline on which that will happen, because there may not be a timeline on which that will happen, and it may not ever happen depending on how things go. And we have some other ways of coping with the size of the main repository, which I'll go over. But for now, if you are going to, for example, build the code for Kubernetes itself, if you're going to work on a feature for the core components of Kubernetes, then this is the repository that you will be going to. Now, under the Kubernetes organization, which I am representing here with K/ because I didn't feel like typing out Kubernetes / 800 times in the slides, but that's what the K/ is there. And also people will refer to it this way as well, or they'll just refer to it. We have a number of repositories that are devoted to running and organizing the project. So this includes K Community, which is actually a critical repository because, yes, community is things like the Contributor Summit, community/events Contributor Summit, right? But it is also things like specification proposals for major features or architecture changes. Let's actually go to that. So, because you notice here, and the master list of SIGs. So if we actually go, like, if you're going to know a second repository, K Community is a really good one to know. Because, for example, there is a folder here for every one of the SIGs, and for most of the working groups, and for other entities like the steering committee and that sort of thing. So this is our sort of information about how the whole project runs, including things like governance information, the code of conduct, and a lot of other stuff. And this is not only information for you, but you will deal with it on an ongoing basis, because if you are proposing a major feature or architecture change, you are almost inevitably going to end up creating a document within the K Community repo in order to back that up. Features. The features repo serves a special purpose. The way the release cycle works right now, if you are proposing a feature for the next release of Kubernetes because you think you can get it finished in the next release of Kubernetes, then you file an issue against the features repo as part of that. And so the features repo is just for tracking. Steering is for the steering committee. Test infra is where all of the code, or most of the code, for our automated testing lives. and you'll hear more about the automated testing later. But if you're getting involved in testing, that's where you go. Except that the performance tests have their own repo because they run somewhat differently from the tests for bugs and just for failing. So these are all the things for a project. And important, these repositories, regardless of where you are working to contribute to Kubernetes, these repositories are probably things that you are going to end up doing as well. Is those. So, documentation and the website are the ones that you're going to touch, right? Primary one is actually called website, despite the fact that what it contains is documentation. Again, it's because our website is our documentation. So we've got the giant documentation website. There's a separate repository for translating the documentation into Chinese. I'm not quite sure why it's a separate repository, but probably because of a documentation sprint. Also for Korean, specifically. Now, we also have a set of repositories devoted to developer tools, for tools, people working on building Kubernetes or Kubernetes components. Some of these are special, they're particular components. For example, there's some samples for controllers, API servers, that sort of thing. K8s.io is actually a set of sites that supply developer information. So things like the testing dashboards, current issue dashboards, and a couple of other things. And we even have a template project if for some reason what you are doing, somebody tells you, hey, you're going to need to create a new repo for that. We have a GitHub template project for what that new repo should look like. Now, confusingly, but importantly for this is, remember I said we've got this gigantic monolithic repository that is the main KK repository. Because it is a gigantic monolithic repository, we have a bunch of mirror repositories called staging repos that mirror specific subdirectories that are kind of detachable components. And these staging repos exist, are complete mirrors. Basically, the same PRs get applied to both. And they exist for build and test of those components, because if you're hacking on only those things. And particularly because there's a number of vendors who fork these things. Like, for example, Client Go, a lot of people have their own controller, like OpenShift has its own controller. I think Tectonic had its own controller that's based on kubectl, and so they use this staging repo to fork it out, so they're not forking the whole code just to build that controller. But this can be really useful if, in fact, you are, say, working on the Kubernetes API server for your sort of build and test workflow to use the staging repo rather than the whole repo, so you're not rebuilding all of the code for the one thing that you want to change. Now, a few of the SIGs have their own separate repositories for things. So the SIG release, so the release team, et cetera, has their own repository for a lot of release-related stuff. Multi-cluster has a repository called Federation, because that was the original name for multi-cluster. And the autoscaler folks have their own, SIG autoscaler has their own repo. Now, you look here and you say, wait a minute, you got 30-odd SIGs. Why do only 3 of them have their own repos? Well, we'll get into that. And then some of the cloud providers have their own repos. So we've got Azure, GCP, OpenStack have their own repos under Kubernetes. But where's Amazon? Surely they have AWS-specific code. We'll get to that. And then there is a whole set of tools. Specific tools that are not core Kubernetes components. Well, some are core Kubernetes components, some are not. But things that you build against Kubernetes, things that you build with Kubernetes that are sort of separate executables that are available for in repositories. So we've got kubeadmin and kubecontrol, and then things like kops, a whole bunch of different installers, an embarrassment of installers, and then things like Helm and like Heapster and Minikube for testing and that sort of thing. And these are all their own repos. And for example, like say you ended up working on Minikube, like trying to port it to a new platform, then that would be against the Minikube repo instead of the main Kubernetes repo. Now, there's a repo called Kube Incubator, a namespace called Kube Incubator. So everything we've done so far has been in the Kubernetes namespace. The second namespace called Kube Incubator. There's 22 projects on it. Do not assume that any of these projects are currently maintained code, because most of them aren't. In fact, we have this sort of historical mess where we have a bunch of random things under Kubernetes. Like, for example, you start looking at this logically and you should say, hey, for example, I said we have an embarrassment of installers under here, and it really is an embarrassment of installers because some of these are abandoned installer projects that are now deprecated in favor of other things. But they still have a repo under Kubernetes. So right now, until we do a cleanup and sort of rationalization, do not assume that the location of a particular repo and which namespace it's in is indicative of its current maintenance status, because it's not. Someday, hopefully, we will get all of this reorganized, and that will actually make some kind of sense. But right now, you need to look at the actual contents of the repo, the current activity, and maybe ask somebody in a SIG before you say, hey, should I actually be modifying this? So the first thing is, we started the Kubernetes project and we said, hey, we need a place for people to put projects that might not go anywhere. And that place was this place called Kube Incubator. But the problem with Kube Incubator is there were no written procedures for how something got into Kube Incubator. Importantly, there were no written procedures for anything got out of Kube Incubator. Right? How do we decide that something is good enough to be part and central enough to be part of core Kubernetes? If it's not going to become part of core Kubernetes, where should it go? If people stop working on it, what should happen to it? None of that was written down. And as a result, we discovered that we didn't actually agree on what the rules for that should be. Same thing with this accumulation thing called Kubernetes/contrib, this contrib single repository under Kubernetes. Again, a random agglomeration of stuff, a lot of it no longer maintained. So, created a new namespace called Kubernetes SIGs. And each under Kubernetes SIGs is, there are repos, and those repos belong to specific SIGs. So, for example, belonging to SIG AWS, there is a couple of repos involving AWS-specific code. And the advantage of this is someone is clearly responsible for determining what happens to that repo, for getting rid of it when it's deprecated, for deciding which bits of code from it will come into central Kubernetes and which bits of code will not and become their own modules or whatever. And so it all goes under SIG. An important thing to know about repositories is repositories can have, we're going to teach you a lot of rules about PRs and issues and other things. These rules all apply to Kubernetes. Specific repositories and the SIGs that maintain them can have slightly different rules based on their decisions. Like, for example, the Helm team for Helm and charts and that sort of thing has their own rules. The docs team has different rules for how PRs get accepted. Those you will be learning because you'll need them, but I'm not going to teach you the Helm team's rules right now because most of you won't be working on Helm. So these can differ. Some things actually for tools that are completely separate from core Kubernetes, they don't necessarily match the main Kubernetes release cycle either. I need to do owners files and then we'll break, yeah? Yeah. And then the last thing is, one of the things we are moving to but have not yet completed yet is the system of owners files, where within directories there's a file called owners, and that file defines who owns any code documents, etc., in that directory or subdirectories, and who gets approval on it, and that approval is then controlled by GitHub bots. This is not entirely complete. There's a bunch of stuff that still is under certain GitHub groups, But this is the goal for this, and certainly Kubernetes, and a lot of other areas is controlled by these owners files. So now we're going to take a break, and there is snacks and hopefully coffee. Is there coffee? There's certainly snacks.
And power strips are coming, so if you grab a snack, you can grab your stuff and make it easier for them to add the power strips on the table.
Cool.
That would be great.
Okay. So snacks, break, power strip. See everyone in about 20 minutes. So get up, stretch, take a bio break, get some coffee. Because we'll be starting in about 20 minutes. We won't start with a hands-on exercise, but we will get into serious hands-on exercises after the break. Because you're all going to create PRs.